There are two kinds of family stories. The ones that get told out loud at reunions, passed around like bread, polished smooth with each retelling until everyone agrees on the shape of them. And then there are the ones that live in cedar boxes and kitchen drawers and the backs of closets, waiting for the day someone decides the truth is more important than the peace. I was 63 years old the summer my mother raised her glass in front of 23 members of my family and told them, one more time, that I had been the difficult one. That I had been the child who made every holiday hard. That whatever went wrong at Christmas, whatever tension sat over the Thanksgiving table like weather, that was mine. My doing. My fault. I smiled. I set my glass down. And the following Monday, I mailed 23 envelopes. But let me start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the real story lives. My name is Rosalind Fairhaven, and I am 63 years old. I live in a white clapboard house on a quiet street in Concord, New Hampshire, 3 blocks from the elementary school where I taught second grade for 29 years before I retired. I have a daughter named Petra who is 31 and lives in Portland, Maine, and a son named Gil who is 28 and lives 20 minutes from me, and they are, without any qualification, the best things I have ever done. I have a garden in the backyard that produces more tomatoes than one person can reasonably use. I have a copper kettle on my stove that was my grandmother's before it was mine. I have a cat named Walter, a large, indifferent orange tabby, who treats my lap as his personal property and my opinions as largely irrelevant. I tell you all of that so you understand who I am before I tell you who my family decided I was. My mother's name is Constance. She is 84 years old. She has lived in the same house in Nashua, New Hampshire for 51 years, and she is, in the way of certain women who have organized their entire sense of self around being the unchallenged center of a room, genuinely gifted at the performance of warmth. Guests adore her. Neighbors bring her casseroles. My cousin Denise once told me that Constance was the most gracious woman she had ever met, and I sat with that sentence for a long time afterward, turning it over, trying to find the angle at which it was also true for me. My brother is named Paul. He is 61. He has my mother's ease in rooms, her talent for being comfortable, her particular gift for occupying space without apology. Growing up, Paul was funny and loose and the kind of boy who charmed teachers without seeming to try. I was none of those things. I was quiet. I read too much. I set the table without being asked, washed dishes before anyone noticed they needed washing, sat with my grandmother when she had her bad spells, and the rest of the family found reasons to be elsewhere. I thought for a very long time that I had simply been born with the wrong temperament for my family. Too serious. Too watchful. Too much. It took me until my 40s to understand that the role had been assigned before I was old enough to refuse it. My mother's mother, my grandmother Estelle, who died when I was 38, had a difficult child too. Her name was Janet, and she was my mother's older sister. I don't know exactly what Janet did or didn't do, what was true and what was story, but I know that by the time I was old enough to sit at the adult table at Thanksgiving, Janet was the name you said carefully, the presence at the edge of every gathering who made my grandmother's shoulders go tight. The difficult one. The dramatic one. The one who couldn't let things go. My mother learned that story before she had children of her own. And then she had children, and she needed a story, and she reached for the one she already knew how to tell. I don't think she chose it consciously. I have thought about this for decades, and I genuinely do not believe my mother sat down one afternoon and decided to sacrifice me. I think she inherited a framework that made every family need one person who carried the difficult. One person whose presence explained the tension. One person whose history could be offered up when the room needed somewhere to put its discomfort. And I was the child who stayed quiet and compliant long enough to fit the shape of that role, and once the shape was formed, it held. That is the most honest thing I can say about my mother, and it has taken me most of my adult life to be able to say it without either rage or grief distorting the sentence. The summer I was 6 years old, my parents hosted Christmas at our house for the first time. 21 people. My grandmother Estelle, my grandfather Roy, aunts and uncles and cousins filling every room. I remember the smell of pine and the particular scrape of folding chairs on the kitchen linoleum and the way the adults laughed at things I didn't understand yet. What I also remember is the dishes. We did not have a dishwasher. My mother had been cooking for 3 days. After the meal, the adults moved to the living room and the cousins scattered outside, and I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the wreckage of 21 people's dinner, and I started washing. I don't know why. I was 6. I think I thought someone would come help, and then nobody did, and I kept going. I remember the water going gray and cooling around my arms. I remember standing on my tiptoes to reach the roasting pan. I remember my Uncle Gerald coming in for more pie and looking at me and saying, "Good girl," and taking the pie and going back to the living room. My mother's friend from down the street, a woman named Rosemary who had come for dessert, walked into the kitchen to refill her glass and stopped. She stood there for a moment looking at me, and then she went and got my mother. What happened next was not what I expected. My mother came into the kitchen and looked at the dishes and then looked at me, and her face did something I could not read at the time, but that I understand now. It was not gratitude. It was not tenderness. It was something closer to irritation, the expression of a woman who has just been made to look bad in front of a guest by her own child's helpfulness. She said, "Why are you in here making a scene? Go play with your cousins." I said I wasn't making a scene, I was doing the dishes. She said, "You're always trying to make me look like I can't take care of things. Go outside." I dried my hands on a kitchen towel, and I went outside. That is the story I carried. The real one, not the one my mother told. The version my mother told was different. In her version, I had refused to go play with the other children. I had sulked in the kitchen to make her feel guilty. I had caused a scene in front of her friend. I had been, as I would be characterized at Christmases and Thanksgivings and Easters for the next 57 years, difficult. I am not entirely sure when I first heard her tell it. I think I was 9 or 10. I heard it from a distance at first, fragments, my name, my aunt's low laugh of recognition. By the time I was a teenager, I had heard enough versions to understand the shape of it. Rosalind sulked. Rosalind made things about herself. Rosalind was the reason Christmas dinners felt strained. I spent years arguing. That is the thing nobody tells you about being the named difficult child in a family system. For a long time, you fight. You correct. You provide context and counterexamples and evidence of your own reasonableness. You think that if you can just say it clearly enough, the record will be set straight. It took me until I was 34, sitting in the office of a woman named Dr. Patricia Hale on a Wednesday afternoon in October, to hear the sentence that finally reorganized everything. Dr. Hale said, "You've been trying to win a verdict in a court that decided the verdict before you were called to testify." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I did not stop attending the family gatherings.
I want to be clear about that.
I kept going. I brought food. I set up folding chairs. I drove my grandmother to her appointments when she was older and nobody else could or would. I sat beside my grandfather when he was dying in a way that Paul simply was not available to do, because Paul had a business that always needed him, and I had summers, and I was already, everyone agreed, the one who handled things. I handled things for decades. And the story didn't change. Some kindnesses are loans the lender forgets they're keeping. I want to tell you about my friend Vera Ingleton because she matters to what happened next. Vera and I met at a teachers' conference in 1994 and have been in each other's lives ever since. She retired 2 years before I did, and now spends her time gardening and reading and telling me the truth when I need it and not telling it to me when I don't. She is 71 years old, sharp as a letter opener, and she was the person I called from the parking lot of the Nashua family reunion grounds at 3:17 in the afternoon on the third Saturday of July. I had been there for 4 hours. It was the Fairhaven family summer reunion, my mother's side, the full extended family, people who came from as far as Vermont and Rhode Island to eat potato salad in the heat and catch up on the year. I had made my grandmother Estelle's recipe potato salad, the one with the celery seed and the yellow mustard, because nobody else ever remembered to, and it had been on the table at every reunion since 1971. I had brought my copper kettle filled with iced tea, because I always did, and people always appreciated it. I had spent the first 2 hours talking to my cousin Denise's teenagers about their college plans and helping my Uncle Roy's wife carry chairs from the parking lot. My mother arrived at noon with Paul and Paul's wife Linda, and she was, as she always was at events with an audience, luminous. She moved through the gathering with that particular grace she had, touching arms and laughing and filling the space around her with warmth. I watched her from across the lawn and felt the familiar thing I always felt at these events, the low, dull ache of a woman who has spent her whole adult life being genuinely proud of her mother's gifts and genuinely invisible to them. At around 2 o'clock, the toasts began. It was the 75th year of the Fairhaven family reunion. My grandmother Estelle had started it in 1949, and every 5 years someone made speeches. My Uncle Arthur stood up and said something about roots and legacy. My cousin Denise's husband read a poem that rhymed in ways that were almost painful. And then my mother stood up. She had a glass of white wine. She was wearing a yellow dress. She looked beautiful, because she always looked beautiful, and she smiled at the 23 faces looking back at her, and she said, "I want to raise a glass to this family, to how far we've all come. Lord knows we had our rough patches." She laughed, and the family laughed with her. We all know who made Christmases hard. She lifted her glass. But here we are anyway. Cheers. 23 people raised their glasses. Nobody corrected her. Nobody looked at me. Or rather, a few people did briefly, the way you glance at something you've decided not to make eye contact with. My cousin Denise's eyes found mine for a moment and then slid away. My Uncle Roy looked at his glass. I smiled. I waited another 40 minutes so it would not look like I was leaving because of the toast. I said goodbye to Denise's teenagers because they had done nothing wrong. I picked up my copper kettle from the food table and I drove home. I got home at 4 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. Walter was asleep on the kitchen counter, which he knows he is not supposed to do, and I didn't have the energy to move him. I put the copper kettle in the sink, and I stood at the window looking at my garden for a long time. I called Vera from the parking lot. I called her again now. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her what had happened, and there was a pause, and she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know. She said, "You've been saying that for 40 years, Rose." I didn't answer. She said, "You have the photograph." And I did. I had kept it in the cedar box on my bedroom bookshelf for 57 years, since the Christmas I was 6 years old. My great-aunt Helen, who had a camera the way other people had habits, had taken it that night, me at the kitchen sink, standing on my tiptoes, arms deep in the soapy water, alone in the kitchen while the rest of the family was in the next room. The flash had caught the profile of my face in a way that was accidental and exact. I was 6 years old, and I was doing all the dishes, and I was doing it alone. I found it in my grandmother Estelle's things after she died. I do not know if my grandmother knew what it meant. I think she did. She kept it in her cedar box, and she left me her cedar box when she died, and I have kept the photograph in it ever since. I sat on the edge of my bed that evening with the photograph in my hands for a long time. Walter came and put his head on my knee, because even indifferent cats know when something is happening. The light in the room went from late afternoon gold to the gray of early evening. I thought about all the Christmases, all the dinners, all the years I had corrected and explained and provided context. I thought about my daughter Petra, who had asked me 3 years ago why I kept going to these gatherings, and I had not had a good answer. I thought about my grandmother Estelle and whether she ever sat somewhere quiet carrying the weight of her sister Janet's story, wondering what was true, wishing someone had kept a photograph. Love that demands you shrink is not love. It is management. I thought about the 23 people at that reunion. I knew most of them well. Some of them, like Denise, I genuinely liked. None of them had said anything in that moment. And I understood why. You don't correct Constance Fairhaven in front of the family, you simply don't, and they had all learned that the way I had. But understanding something and accepting it as the permanent arrangement of things are two different decisions. I sat there until 9:30 that night. Then I got up, put on the kettle, made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea from the tin with the den on the lid, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote a list of names. 23 households. I looked up current addresses for the ones I wasn't sure of. I took out the photograph and held it under the kitchen light one more time. I was not angry by that point. That is the part that is hard to explain. I had been through anger. I had been through grief and argument and years of quiet accommodation, and the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a story about yourself that you know is wrong. By that Sunday night, I was 63 years old, and what I felt was not anger. I felt clear. I want to tell you something about the decision. There was a night, it was the Tuesday before I mailed them, the night I sat in my car in the post office parking lot at 7:40 p.m. for 22 minutes with the envelopes in a stack on the passenger seat, when I almost didn't do it. I had addressed all 23 envelopes by hand. I had made 23 copies of the photograph at the pharmacy on Cedar Street, the same one I have used for 30 years, and the woman at the counter had looked at the image, and then looked at me, and not said anything, and I had been grateful for her quiet. I had written a single note to accompany each photograph, the same 3 sentences in each one. This was taken at Christmas 1967 at our house in Nashua. I was 6 years old. I wanted each of you to have a copy. I drove to the post office on Tuesday morning, and I sat in the parking lot and I thought, what happens after? I thought about my mother's face. I thought about Paul calling me. I thought about the family group text, and what would be said in it. I thought about Denise, specifically, who had been the only one to look at me at the reunion, whose eyes had found mine for that half-second before sliding away. I thought about whether sending this would sever things permanently or change them into something I didn't recognize. And then I thought about the version of this story that would exist if I said nothing. My mother at 90, making that toast. My mother at 94. Paul repeating it to his grandchildren the way family stories get passed. Me at 70, at 75, still the difficult one. Still responsible for every Christmas that had ever gone sideways. And I thought about my daughter Petra, who is 31 and sharp and watchful in a way that tells me she sees things, and what it would mean for her to inherit this story untouched. I picked up the stack of envelopes. I walked to the slot. I dropped them in. I drove home without the radio on. The first call came on Thursday. The photograph had been mailed Monday. I had allowed for 3 days of transit, and the first households to receive it were in the Nashua area. It was not my mother. It was not Paul. It was my great-aunt Helen. Helen Fairhaven is 89 years old, and she is the woman who took the photograph. I did not know if she remembered taking it. I had not told anyone I had it. When her number appeared on my phone at 11:22 Thursday morning, I sat very still for a moment before I answered. She said, "Rosalind." I said, "Aunt Helen." She said, "I took that photograph." I said, "I know." There was a pause. Then she said, "I took it because I thought somebody should." We were both quiet for a moment after that. Then Aunt Helen said, "Your grandmother kept it because she knew. She always knew." Another pause. "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to say that to you." I did not cry on the phone. I did not cry until after I hung up, and then I cried for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with the Earl Grey tin in front of me and Walter in my lap, and it was not sadness exactly. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room you had stopped expecting to change. By Friday morning I had received 14 other calls and 7 texts. Denise called Friday at 6:47 a.m. Her voice was careful and her words were chosen, and what she said, in essence, was that she had known the story wasn't right for a long time and hadn't known what to do with that knowing, and she was sorry. My cousin Arthur's daughter, a woman named Simone whom I had not spoken to in 7 years, texted to say she had a photograph of her own, one from Easter 1972, me at 9 years old, ironing the tablecloth while the adults were in the living room. She did not know I had ever needed it, and she was going to mail it to me. The call I did not receive on Friday was from my mother.
Paul called Friday afternoon.
I let it go to voicemail. He called again Saturday morning, and I answered. He said, "What are you trying to do?" I said, "I mailed people a photograph, Paul." He said, "You upset, Mom?" I said, "I imagine she's uncomfortable. That's not the same as being upset." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's 84, Rose." I said, "She was 41 when she started telling that story. She had 40 years to choose differently." He said, "This is exactly," and stopped himself. I waited. He said, "This is exactly what she means." I said, "I know." And then I said, "I'm not going to argue about it, Paul. I mailed a photograph. The photograph is accurate. If what's in it is uncomfortable to look at, I think we should talk about why that is." He said he needed to think, and he would call me later. He did not call later. He called the following Wednesday, and that conversation was different. Shorter and quieter, and without the same architecture of defense in it. He did not apologize exactly, but he said he had been looking at the photograph for 5 days and that he had been in the living room that Christmas. He was 8. He remembered. He had just never thought about what it meant that I was not. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. My mother called on Sunday. That was 9 days after the mailing. Her voice when she called was not what I expected. I had been waiting for cold or sharp or the controlled precision of a woman managing a situation. What I heard instead was something more fragile. She said my name twice before she said anything else. Then she said, "Your grandmother kept that photograph." I said, "Yes." She said, "She never showed it to me." I said, "No." There was a long silence. I let it sit there between us. She said, "I don't know why I told it the way I did." That was the closest thing to accountability I had ever heard from my mother in 63 years, and I understood it for exactly what it was. Not an apology, not a full reckoning, but a crack in the architecture. A woman of 84 standing at the edge of a story she had told for 57 years and feeling, for possibly the first time, its weight on the wrong side. I said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I've been all right for a long time, Mom. I just thought people should know what was true." We stayed on the phone for 12 more minutes. We talked about the reunion, about Denise's teenagers, about whether the potato salad recipe needed more celery seed. It was a strange conversation, ordinary and tentative and careful, and when I hung up I sat at my kitchen table and thought about my grandmother Estelle, who had kept the photograph for 32 years before she left it to me, who had known, who had carried that knowing the way I carried the photograph. I thought about her sister Janet, the original difficult one, who died in 1984 without ever, as far as I knew, being seen clearly by the family she grew up in. A family will tell you blood is thicker than water until the day blood asks them to give something up. The thing about patterns is that they move through generations the way water moves through a house, finding the path of least resistance, pooling in the lowest places, doing its work quietly until someone follows the source. My grandmother broke the pattern partway. She kept the photograph. She kept it and she left it to me, and she trusted, perhaps, that I would know what to do with it when the time came. It took me 57 years to understand what she was handing me. I want to tell you what life looked like in the months after. The family did not fracture the way I had feared it might. Some people drew back. Paul was quieter with me through the fall, and my mother and I exist now in a different register than we ever have, something more honest and more careful, and less warm on the surface, but also less false underneath it. I do not know if that is better. I think it is truer. Denise and I have become closer. She called me in September to tell me she had started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sandra Osei, and that some of what she was working on was the way she had learned to look away from things in her family, and she was trying to stop doing that. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. My great-aunt Helen sent me a letter in August. 3 pages, handwritten, in the cramped script of a woman who learned to write before ballpoint pens were standard. She told me things about my grandmother and her sister Janet that I had not known. She told me that Estelle had spent her whole life feeling that she had not protected Janet enough, and that she had loved me fiercely partly because of that guilt and partly because, as Helen put it, you were always the child who saw things clearly and nobody gave you credit for it. I read that letter 4 times. I have put it in the cedar box. My daughter Petra called me the week after the photograph arrived. She had gotten one too. I mailed her a copy separately because I thought she deserved to know this part of her history. She called and was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, you are 6. I said, "I was 6. She said, "You didn't deserve any of that." I said, "No, I didn't." She said, "I'm glad you sent it." My son Gil came over for dinner the following week, and we sat on the back porch after dark and talked for 3 hours. He said he had always felt the tension at family gatherings but had not known its shape, and now he understood it differently. He said he was glad I was his mother. I told him that was the best thing anyone had said to me in years, and we laughed, And Walter came and sat between us on the porch boards and was indifferent to us both in his reliable way. I am not going to tell you my mother is a different woman. She is not. She is 84, and she has told a story for 57 years, and stories that old do not dissolve in a season. But something shifted in her. I see it when we talk, something less armored, something that occasionally allows a silence to exist without filling it. Whether that deepens into something more honest or settles back into the old patterns, I cannot tell you. I am not waiting on the answer. I am done building my sense of myself around what she chooses to do with it. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. Compassion is not a key to my front door. What I have now is something I spent decades thinking was impossible. The record corrected. Not loudly. Not by argument or confrontation, or the kind of scorched earth reckoning that would have cost me the parts of my family